Before I tell you about the woman on Widow's Peak, I need you to understand something about the town of Harrow Creek, Missouri. There are places that hold their silence the way old stone holds cold, not as an absence, but as a weight, a pressure you feel the moment you arrive. A town that has been keeping a secret so long it has stopped calling it a secret. It calls it simply the way things are. Harrow Creek was such a place. 3 people had died in 14 months. A farmer, a woman, a young schoolteacher who had only just arrived and made the fatal mistake of asking too many questions about the wrong family. No arrests, no real investigation, no one willing to look directly at what everyone already knew. And on the ridge above the town, in a cabin that the townspeople spoke of in whispers, a woman had been watching, waiting, building something that no one around her believed could ever be used. She had been at it for 40 years. This is the story of what patience that deep can accomplish, and what it costs. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens in the final act of this story is not what you will expect. And the last thing she says to the man who finally comes up that ridge, I have been thinking about it ever since I first found this account. The autumn of 1889 had arrived early in the Missouri Hill Country and had not been subtle about it. The cold came down from the north at the beginning of October and settled into the creek hollows with the deliberate permanence of a long-term tenant who had no intention of leaving until spring forced the issue. Samuel Crane rode in from the south on a Tuesday afternoon with the collar of his wool coat turned high, and his eyes moving across the settlement ahead of him, with the particular, practiced attention of a man who had learned that the most important information in any new place was not what people did, but what they did not do. He was 34 years old, lean through the jaw and the shoulders in the way of men who never quite sat still long enough to carry extra weight. He worked as a circuit investigator for the state, not a sheriff, not a deputy, not any title that the locals of Harrow Creek would have been entirely comfortable assigning to a man who had ridden in from outside their particular arrangement of loyalties. His assignment was 3 pages long and took him less than 10 minutes to read on the train from the capital. 3 unexplained deaths, 14 months, no formal inquests, a set of official reports thin enough to suggest that someone had taken deliberate care to keep them that way. The first was Abel Prout, a farmer, found at the base of a limestone gorge at the edge of his own property. The county physician had noted injuries consistent with a fall and had left it at that. A determination arrived at, Crane noticed, without any recorded examination of the surrounding area or any account of who had found the body or under what circumstances. The second was Ida Mercer, wife of Clifton Mercer, a man with close ties to the town's most prominent family. She had been found unresponsive in her own home. Cause of death listed as cardiac episode. The physician who had signed that certificate had since relocated to another county. No forwarding address on record. The third was Thomas Reeve, 26 years old, a schoolteacher who had come to Harrow Creek from St. Louis 8 months before his death, bringing with him a quiet enthusiasm for local history and a habit of asking careful questions of the families whose children sat in his classroom. His frozen body had been discovered 2 miles into the ridge timber, far from any path a reasonable man would choose to walk in November. 3 deaths, 3 different circumstances, one pattern if you were willing to look for it. The state evidently had decided finally that it was worth sending someone who was. Crane tied his horse outside the only inn Harrow Creek appeared to possess, a low building of dark timber with a painted sign above the door reading Alderman's, and stood for a moment in the cold street. The town was quiet in the particular way that towns are quiet when the people in them have seen a stranger arrive and are making a collective, unspoken decision about whether to acknowledge it. A pair of old men on a bench near the dry goods store watched him with the focused patience of people who had elevated observation into a full-time occupation. A child disappeared around the corner of a building. A door closed somewhere up the street. And then he saw her. Across the road, at the narrow mouth of a lane between two weathered buildings, a woman stood watching him. She was older, 70 perhaps, dressed entirely in dark clothing, her gray hair pulled back precisely beneath a black bonnet, her hands still at her sides. She was not threatening. She was not welcoming. She was simply present, measuring. With the specific, unhurried patience of someone who had watched many men arrive in Harrow Creek, and had formed a considered opinion about most of them before they had finished tying their horses. Crane held her gaze. She did not look away. She did not move. Then, with the calm economy of someone who had made whatever assessment she needed to make, she turned and walked down the lane and disappeared from view. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the empty space where she had been. Then he pushed open the door to Alderman's. The conversation inside stopped the instant he crossed the threshold. 5 men at various tables. Farmers, by the look of their hands and their posture, the permanent stoop of men who spent their lives bent toward the earth. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with careful eyes and a gray beard, set down a glass and waited. Crane placed his state identification on the bar. Samuel Crane, circuit investigator. I am here about the 3 deaths. The innkeeper looked at the card. He looked at Crane. He glanced, briefly and almost imperceptibly, at the men behind him. Then he looked back at the card the way a man looks at something he recognizes but would prefer not to acknowledge. Harlan Bode, the man said finally, I run this place. He did not offer his hand. I will need a room, Crane said, and I will need to speak with people. Anyone who knew the deceased, anyone who can speak to what happened. Harlan Bode picked up the glass he had been polishing and resumed polishing it. People here don't talk much to strangers. That tends to be true of places where something has gone wrong and the going wrong has not been properly addressed, Crane said, without sharpness, as though observing the weather. He settled onto a stool. The woman across the street, black dress, gray hair, standing at the lane when I arrived. Who is she? The glass was set down, picked up, set down again. That's Wren Ashby, Harlan said, his voice dropping half a register without apparent intention. She lives up on Widow's Peak, the North Ridge, has done for 30-odd years. Is she connected to the deaths? The question landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Crane felt the men behind him shift without turning to look. Harlan Bode placed both hands flat on the bar and looked at Crane with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very tired. Wren Ashby, he said quietly, is connected to everything in this town. Every good thing and every terrible thing that has come to pass in Harrow Creek over the last 30 years traces back to her somehow, or to the people who made her what she is. Whether anyone around here will say so in plain language is a different matter entirely. He poured water without being asked and slid it across the bar. Get some rest, he said. You are going to need more than one night here. Crane spent the rest of the afternoon on foot, moving through Harrow Creek's single main street with the methodical patience that his work required. He noted details that did not announce themselves. The mill at the south end of town, running at a fraction of its evident capacity. 3 or 4 houses with shutters drawn in the middle of the afternoon. The way people on the street moved, not exactly afraid, but watchful. The particular posture of men and women who had been carefully measuring the cost of speaking plainly for so long that the calculation had become involuntary. At the dry goods store, he bought tobacco he had no use for and allowed the owner, a nervous, voluble man named Silas Webb, who appeared to be genuinely starved for conversation that did not carry a social cost, to talk at his own speed. Silas had a tendency to approach difficult subjects the way a man approaches a dog he is not entirely sure of from a considerable distance, with a great deal of preliminary movement, and with one eye always on the nearest exit. Abel Prout, Silas said at one point, straightening a shelf that was already straight, was a decent man, Minded his own business. Didn't bother a soul. Did anyone bother him? Crane asked. Silas's hands went still on the shelf. His land, he said carefully, shared a boundary with the North Ridge. There had been a dispute about the eastern fence line with the Mercers. Crane waited. This was a skill, one of the most important ones in his profession. Most people, given sufficient silence, will eventually fill it. The Mercers, Silas continued in the same careful, circling manner, are the most prominent family in this part of the county. Edmund is the eldest. He runs the mill and holds most of the commercial interests in and around Harrow Creek. His brother Vernon sits on the county land commission, and their younger brother Clifton. Silas cleared his throat. His wife was Ida, the second one to die. They are not bad men, Silas was careful to add. Not in any obvious way. They are simply men who have accumulated a great deal over a long time and have grown entirely accustomed to the assumption that what they want, they will eventually acquire. And Wren Ashby, Crane pressed. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the wind moved through the ridge timber with a sound like slow breathing. Wren Ashby was here before the Mercers had any of what they have now. She and her husband Nathan settled Widow's Peak in the late 1840s. Good timber up there. Good creek access on the eastern slope. Nathan died of a fever in the winter of 1855, left her alone with a boy, Eli, who was 7 years old. Silas paused. He turned to face Crane directly, which he had not done before. She stayed, raised the boy alone on that ridge. For 15 years she managed it. It was hard, but it was hers. And then the Mercers came and they wanted the timber rights to the North Ridge property, and when Wren wouldn't sell, they found other ways to proceed. What kind of ways? The kind that leave no marks, Silas said flatly. Vernon was on the land commission by then. Boundary adjustments, a few feet at a time. Documentation filed cleanly and quietly. Each adjustment small enough to challenge individually and nearly impossible to fight collectively without money and lawyers and time, none of which Wren had. He looked at the floor. And her son. Eli Ashby died in the spring of 1873. He was 22 years old. He went to speak with Edmund Mercer's men about the fence line on the eastern boundary. He went alone, against his mother's wishes. They found him at the base of the ridge that afternoon. The county ruled it accidental. Edmund Mercer said his men had no knowledge of any meeting. There were no witnesses willing to speak. He said it the way people say things they have repeated so many times the weight has worn smooth. After Eli died, Silas continued quietly, Wren stopped coming into town much. People said she had gone strange with grief. Said things about her, the way people say things when they are frightened of something they cannot name and need the fear to have a shape. He looked up. But she was not strange. She was a woman who had lost everything and understood precisely who had taken it, and she never stopped watching them, all these years. Watching and waiting for what? Crane asked. Silas met his eyes. For what comes, he said simply. When men who have spent 40 years making enemies finally run out of room to hide from the accounting that evening, Crane sat alone at a corner table in Alderman's with the 3 case files spread before him in the lamplight. He read each one a 4th time slowly, looking not for facts but for shapes. Abel Prout, land dispute with the Mercer family. Dead at the base of a gorge on his own property, ruled accidental. Ida Mercer, wife of the Mercer family's closest associate, dead in her home, cause undetermined, quickly closed. Thomas Reeve, schoolteacher, new to Harrow Creek, had been, according to a single brief handwritten note tucked into the back of his file, asking questions about the town's history and the Ashby land matter. Dead in the ridge timber, ruled exposure. 3 people, 3 different circumstances, but each one had been pulling at the same thread, the long, unresolved thread that ran from Widow's Peak down through 40 years of Mercer influence, and emerged in the present as 3 bodies in a town that had learned, through long and careful practice, to look away. Crane closed the files and looked out the frost-edged window. The north ridge was a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, and in a single window of what he understood must be Wren Ashby's cabin near the summit of that ridge, a lamp burned steady, unmoving, patient. It was easier, he understood, to believe in a curse than to believe in 40 years of deliberate institutional corruption. Easier to call a woman dangerous than to call a system what it was. Wren Ashby hadn't placed any darkness over Harrow Creek. Harrow Creek had constructed that darkness itself. And the real spell, the one that had kept every person in this town silent and compliant for 4 decades, was simply the belief that nothing could change. That the Mercers were as permanent as the ridge itself. That anyone who said otherwise would end up like Abel Prout, like Ida Mercer, like Thomas Reeve. That was the spell no one had dared to break. Crane gathered his files and placed them inside his coat. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go up the ridge. He would speak to Wren Ashby. The morning came gray and hard, the kind of November morning that offered light without warmth, as though the sun had appeared out of sheer obligation and intended to do the absolute minimum required. Crane ate breakfast alone in aldermans, black coffee, cornbread, the particular silence of a room full of people carefully pretending not to watch him. Then he buttoned his coat and walked out into the cold. The road to the North Ridge began just past the padlocked schoolhouse, locked since Thomas Reeve's death 2 months prior, and climbed steeply into the pines through a series of switchbacks that revealed their true difficulty only after the first quarter mile, when the grade sharpened and the trees closed in on either side, and the settlement below disappeared entirely. He walked steadily, his boots crunching through the frost crust on the path. The timber up here was different from the valley, older, denser, the kind of forest that had never been cleared because no one had found it worth the effort, or had understood, perhaps instinctively, that some places prefer to be left alone. The pines gave way to bare-limbed oaks and chestnuts, their branches interlocked overhead in a pattern that turned the sky into a series of pale, broken fragments. Birds were absent entirely. The only sound was his own breathing and the occasional low crack of ice in the timber after 40 minutes of climbing. The path leveled briefly onto a narrow shelf of land, and Crane saw the cabin. It was smaller than he had imagined, a sturdy structure of hewn timber and stone, with a chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose straight and vertical in the windless cold, a woodpile stacked with precise economy against the south wall, a kitchen garden, dormant and brown now, enclosed by a low fence, 2 windows facing the valley below, their glass clouded with age. The cabin had the quality of something maintained with great care under difficult circumstances, not prosperous, but not defeated either. It was the house of someone who had made a decision, some decades ago, to stay, and had never revisited that decision. Wren Ashby was standing on the porch. She had seen him coming, had been watching him, he suspected, for the last 10 minutes of his climb. She stood with her arms at her sides, dressed as she had been the day before, black coat, dark bonnet, gray hair pinned back with that same severe precision. In the daylight and at close range, she was older than he had estimated, closer to 75 than 70, her face deeply lined, her hands visible at her sides, the hands of someone who had spent decades working entirely alone. But her eyes were something else, dark brown, completely steady. They held none of the uncertainty or softness that old age sometimes brings. They held the concentrated stillness of someone who had been waiting for a very specific moment and recognized it the instant it arrived. "Mr. Crane," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying no warmth but no hostility either. Simply directness. "Mrs. Ashby," Crane stopped at the base of the porch steps. "You know who I am." "Word travels here," she said, "even when people pretend it doesn't." She studied him for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone running a calculation she had run many times before. "You had better come inside. What I have to say will take some time." The interior of the cabin was spare and absolutely clean. A stone fireplace occupied the north wall and a good fire burned in it, filling the room with dry, resinous warmth. A table, two chairs, a shelf of books, a narrow bed behind a curtain at the far end. On the table, a tin cup of tea cooling beside a stack of documents weighted down by a smooth river stone. The accumulated possessions of a life stripped down to what was necessary, nothing more. Wren sat across from Crane at the table and folded her hands before her with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times and had finally decided the rehearsal was finished. "You have spoken to Sela's Webb," she said. "It was not a question. Then you know the broad shape of it, the land, my husband, Eli." She said her son's name without flinching, in the way that people say the names of the dead when they have grieved so completely and so long that the grief has become structural, part of the architecture of who they are rather than something that still breaks them open. What Silas did not tell you, because he does not know all of it, is what happened after. Crane reached for his notebook. Wren looked at it, then at him. "Put that away," she said. "I will tell you what I know, but I will not be a document. I have been a document long enough in their land records, their commission rulings, their accident reports. I will speak to you as one person to another. Then you can decide what to do with what you hear." Crane set the notebook on the table between them, visible but closed. She nodded slightly, and she began. She and her husband Nathan had come to the Missouri Hills in 1848. Nathan was a carpenter from Virginia who had read about land grants in a newspaper and believed, with the straightforward optimism of a young man in a new country, that a man could build something lasting if he chose the right ground and worked it honestly. They had chosen Widow's Peak, called something different then, before the name acquired its meaning, because the timber was good and the creek access on the eastern slope was reliable, and no one else had yet laid claim to it. Which should have told them something, she said, but it didn't. Nathan died of fever in the winter of 1855, leaving Wren alone with Eli, who was 7 years old. She had not gone back east. There was nothing to go back to. Her own family was gone. Nathan's family was distant and not particularly interested in a widowed daughter-in-law with a child on a ridge in Missouri. So she had stayed and worked the land and raised her son. For roughly 15 years she had managed a life that was hard but sufficient. The Mercers had arrived in the early 1860s, drawn by the mill opportunity and the timber contracts that the post-war years had opened up. Edmund first, then his brothers, accumulating interests in and around Harrow Creek with the particular focused efficiency of men who understood that the real capital in a small settlement was not money, but the systems that governed what money could buy. "Edmund Mercer," Wren said, "is a man of considerable intelligence and negligible conscience. In my experience, that is the most dangerous combination a person can possess. He understands systems, legal systems, financial systems, the unspoken social systems of a small community, and he understands how to operate within them to accomplish ends that cruder men would have pursued with direct force." She paused. "He never threatened me, not once in 20 years. He was far too careful for that. Instead, he had his brother Vernon on the Land Commission by 1868 make small, quiet adjustments to the recorded boundary of my property. 60 feet here. A surveyor's notation corrected there. Each one individually defensible, each one part of a pattern unmistakable to anyone looking at the whole, but nearly impossible to challenge in any single instance." "What was the effect?" Crane asked. "The first adjustment cut off my direct access to the creek on the eastern slope. Without that access, watering the garden and the animals through the dry months required going the long way around, an extra mile and a half each day. He had studied the land before he moved. He knew exactly what that access meant to me." Crane said nothing. "I filed a protest with the commission. Vernon sat on the commission. It was dismissed. I hired a lawyer from the county seat. He came, examined the records, and told me the documentation was entirely clean and there was nothing he could do. Which was true, the documentation was clean because Vernon had made it clean. She looked at her hands on the table. That is what Edmund understood. If you control the records, you control what happened. Whatever the records say occurred, occurred. Whatever they say did not occur, did not. It is not complicated, but it is very effective because most people, when they are told that the official documentation says one thing, will eventually stop trusting their own memory of another. The boundary adjustments continued over the following years, she told him. Each one challenged, each protest dismissed, each round of legal contest consuming what remained of her savings until she reached the point where she had no resources left to fight with, which had, she was quite certain, been the precise intended outcome from the beginning. Eli was 21 by then, she said. 22 that spring, he was. She stopped, looked at the fire. When she continued, her voice had not changed in volume but had changed in some quality that Crane could not quite name, become denser perhaps. More weighted. He was a good young man, better than the situation deserved. He had his father's belief that things could be resolved fairly if you approached them directly and honestly. In the spring of 1873, he went to speak with Edmund Mercer's men about the eastern fence line. He went alone. He told me he was going. I told him not to. She paused. He went anyway. Silence. They found him at the base of the ridge that afternoon. The county said he had fallen. Edmund Mercer said his men had no knowledge of any meeting. There were no witnesses, or rather, there were no witnesses willing to speak. She looked at Crane directly. You understand that distinction, Mr. Crane. There is a considerable difference between no witnesses and no witnesses willing to speak. I understand it, Crane said. After Eli died, I had nothing left to lose, which is a terrible thing to become, but it is also, in its way, a kind of freedom. I stopped filing protests. I stopped hearing lawyers. I stopped operating within any system that Edmund Mercer had already arranged to his own benefit. She straightened in her chair. Instead, I watched. I kept records of my own. Every boundary adjustment, every commission ruling, every transaction involving Mercer land or Mercer interests, from the earliest I could document to the present. I spoke, quietly and carefully, with others who had been similarly treated. There were more than people knew. The Mercers had not limited their methods to me. She reached across the table and lifted the river stone from the stack of papers. 18 years of documentation. And then, 14 months ago, Abel Prout came to me. Abel Prout had found something. A set of original survey documents from the early 1860s, before Vernon Mercer had joined the commission, that recorded the true boundary lines for 7 properties in the Harrow Creek area, including his own and Wren Ashby's. Documents that proved, without ambiguity, that the commission records had been deliberately and systematically falsified. He had found them in a deed box that had belonged to his father, Wren said. Documents his father had filed away and apparently never spoken of, perhaps because he too had calculated the cost of speaking and found it too high. She tapped the stack of papers with one finger. Abel brought them to me because I was the one person in Harrow Creek who had been fighting the Mercers long enough to understand their significance. We were building a case together, a real one, with documentation sufficient to carry to the state commission in the capital, above the county level, above Edmund Mercer's reach. And then Abel died, Crane said. 3 weeks after he brought me those documents, found at the base of the gorge on his own land, a gorge he had walked past every day of his adult life. She held Crane's gaze without wavering. Abel Prout did not fall, Mr. Crane. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the bare branches of the oaks with a low, continuous sound. Ida Mercer, Crane said. Wren's expression shifted, not softening exactly but taking on a different quality, something closer to sorrow. Ida was Clifton Mercer's wife. She had been in that household for 14 years and she had heard things, conversations, names, arrangements. She had been quietly writing things down herself, keeping her own account, and she made the mistake of trusting her husband with what she was doing. Wren paused. Clifton Mercer is a weak man in the specific way that makes weak men dangerous. His loyalty goes entirely to whoever frightens him most, he told Edmund. 2 months later, Ida was dead. And Thomas Reeve, Crane said. Thomas was a careful young man, too careful, as it turned out, for his own safety. He had been asking questions of the families with children in his classroom, drawing out stories about the land disputes, the commission adjustments, the long pattern of it. He had been corresponding with a newspaper editor in St. Louis. She folded her hands again on the table and looked at Crane with an expression of absolute composure that he recognized now for what it truly was. Not coldness. The carefully maintained discipline of someone who had not permitted herself to come apart in 40 years, because coming apart had never been a luxury her situation allowed. "I am 73 years old," she said. "I have lived on this ridge since Daniel died. The town believes I am something to be feared, a woman made strange by isolation and grief, a source of the misfortunes that accumulate around this place like bad weather. I have not corrected that belief, because it has kept Edmund Mercer's men from coming up here to do to me what they did to Abel and Ida and Thomas." She met his eyes. "But I am not darkness, Mr. Crane. I am a record. 40 years of documentation, carefully maintained, waiting for someone with the authority and the will to use it." She looked at the stack of papers between them. "The question is whether you are that person." Crane sat with the documents for 2 hours at Wren's table, while she moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire and preparing food with the efficiency of someone who had made peace with solitude a long time ago. He read through everything methodically. The original survey records Abel Prout had found. Wren's 18 years of compiled notations, names and dates and transactions, the pattern that emerged from the accumulation of detail, the way a face emerges from a collection of its individual features. It was meticulous, it was thorough, and it was, in his professional assessment, more than sufficient. What he was looking at was not the work of a woman made strange by grief. It was the work of someone who had understood very early that the only instrument left available to her was patience. The willingness to accumulate evidence across decades when every other avenue had been sealed off. To maintain records with perfect discipline when everyone around her had decided the Mercers were immovable, and that looking directly at what they had done was simply not worth the personal cost. He closed the last document and looked up. Wren was standing at the window, looking down toward the valley where the smoke from Harrow Creek's chimneys rose in thin columns against the gray November sky. "Reeve was corresponding with an editor in St. Louis," Crane said. "A man named Wallace Cord at the Missouri Examiner," she said without turning. "I have his address. Thomas gave it to me before she stopped, then resumed, before November." Crane stood and gathered the documents carefully, squaring the edges. "I am going to need to take these to the Capitol, to the State Commission and the Attorney General's office. This exceeds what I am authorized to address alone." Wren turned from the window. She looked at the documents in his hands, 40 years of her life, the record of everything that had been taken from her, with an expression he could not quite read. Not reluctance. Something more complex than that. The expression of someone releasing something they had held so long that the holding had become indistinguishable from who they were. "I made copies," she said quietly, "years ago. They are held by a solicitor in the county seat, sealed, with instructions to open them if anything happens to me." She paused. "I am not a fool, Mr. Crane. I have survived 40 years in this valley by not being a fool." "No," Crane said, "you are not." He buttoned his coat and gathered the documents inside it, held close against his chest. At the door, he turned back. "The town calls you the woman on Widow's Peak," he said. "Speaks your name as though it explains something dark." Wren Ashby looked at him from across the room. Small and old and absolutely unbowed, the fire behind her, 40 years of solitary endurance in her eyes. "The town," she said, "calls anything it does not understand by a name that makes it easier to ignore." She turned back to the window. "Go do what you came here to do, Mr. Crane. I will be here when you need me." He walked out into the cold. Behind him, the door of the cabin closed quietly, and the smoke from the chimney continued to rise straight and steady into the pale November sky. Crane came down from the ridge in the early afternoon, with the documents pressed flat against his chest beneath his coat, and his mind working through the architecture of what Wren had given him. He was halfway down when he heard the horse. It came from below, moving up the path toward him with the unhurried confidence of a rider who was not in a particular hurry, because he believed he held every advantage. Crane stepped to the side of the path and waited. A moment later, a rider came around the lower switchback and pulled up sharply at the sight of him. The man was perhaps 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, the ruddy complexion of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors by choice rather than necessity. Well dressed for Harrow Creek, good wool coat, good boots, a horse that was noticeably better fed than the animals tied outside Alderman's. He looked at Crane with an expression that arranged itself into friendliness, approximately half a second too slowly. "You would be the state man," the rider said. "Samuel Crane," Crane confirmed. He did not move from the center of the path. "And you are Edmund Mercer." The man touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that managed to convey both courtesy and condescension simultaneously. "I heard you had arrived. Thought I ought to come introduce myself, given that I am the closest thing this part of the county has to a civic leader." He looked past Crane up the path, then back. "You have been up to see Wren Ashby." It was not a question. The calculation behind it was visible for exactly a moment before Edmund Mercer's expression of concern reasserted itself. "I have," Crane said. Edmund settled back in his saddle. "I hope she was of some help to you. She is a troubled woman, Mr. Crane, has been for many years. The loss of her son affected her very deeply, as anyone might understand. But grief can do things to a person's relationship with the truth over time. It can lead them to construct narratives that give the grief a place to live." He shook his head with what appeared to be sincere regret. "She has attributed blame to my family for Eli's death for going on 20 years. It is a painful thing to be on the receiving end of. I have tried to respond to it with patience, but I would ask you to weigh whatever she has told you with that context in mind." Crane looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the context," he said pleasantly. "I will certainly weigh it carefully alongside the documentary evidence." Something moved behind Edmund Mercer's eyes, brief, controlled, immediately suppressed. "Documentary evidence," he said. "Survey records, commission rulings, transaction histories going back to 1862. Standard investigative practice. I am sure you understand." Edmund Mercer looked at him steadily for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled, a smile that reached every part of his face except his eyes. "Of course, if there is anything my family can do to assist your investigation, Mr. Crane, you need only ask. We have nothing to conceal and every interest in seeing the truth established properly." He turned his horse back down the path. "Good afternoon." Crane watched him go until the sound of hooves faded into the trees. Then he stood very still for a moment, one hand pressed against his chest where the documents rested, and understood with complete clarity that he had perhaps 12 hours, possibly less, before Edmund Mercer made a decision about how to respond. He went directly back to Alderman's, bypassing the main street, and found Harlan Bode alone behind the bar. Crane sat across from him and spoke quietly and without ceremony. "Edmund Mercer knows I have been up to see Wren Ashby. He knew before I came back down. Someone told him I was going up there this morning. Harlan set down the bottle he was holding and looked at the table. That wasn't me. I believe you, but someone did. Crane leaned forward. Is there anyone in this town I can trust completely? Not someone who privately resents the Mercers, someone who will actually act when the moment requires it. Harlan was quiet for a considerable while. The fire popped and settled. The short autumn afternoon was already collapsing toward darkness outside. Nora Prout, he said at last. Abel's widow. She knows what happened to her husband. She has been quiet about it because she has 2 children and nowhere to go. But she knows, and she is not a woman who will lie to your face if you ask her a direct question. He paused. And there is Clement Dark. He runs the farrier shop at the south end. Edmund tried to buy his property 3 years ago. Clement refused. There have been difficulties between them since. Clement is not a man who frightens easily. I need to speak with both of them tonight, Crane said, quietly. You're moving fast, Harlan said. The man I met on that path today is not going to wait to see what I do next, Crane said. He is going to move first if he can. Nora Prout lived in a farmhouse at the north end of the settlement, behind a fence that Abel had built, and that she had maintained ever since with the same stubborn competence she brought to everything in her life since his death. She was 36 years old, dark-haired, with a directness in her manner that 14 months of grief had not been able to erode into bitterness. She opened the door before Crane knocked. She had seen him coming up the road. You have been up to see Wren, she said. Is it that obvious? You have the look of someone whose suspicions have just been confirmed in detail. She stepped back from the door. Come in. 2 children sat at a table doing schoolwork by lamplight. Nora sent them to the back room with a word and a look, then turned to Crane and sat down. She told him everything she knew in the organized, precise manner of someone who had been holding it ready for a very long time. Abel had found the original survey documents in the deed box his father had left behind, a box that had sat undisturbed for 20 years because Abel's father had evidently calculated, as so many had, that the cost of using them was too high. When Abel understood what they meant, he had gone first to Wren because she was the only person in Harrow Creek who would immediately grasp their significance. He came home that night, Nora said, and he was lit up. The way he used to get when he believed in something completely. He said it was finally enough, that they could finally do something. She looked at her hands. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Were there any signs in those 3 weeks, Crane asked, that he was being watched? Any unusual visitors? Nora thought carefully. A man came to the farm, she said he was from the county assessor's office, asked to look at the property records. Abel let him in. The man went through the deed box. She paused. He would have seen that the original survey documents were gone. Crane absorbed this. Nora, did Abel make copies of those documents before giving them to Wren? He did, she said immediately. Abel was a careful man. He made 2 copies, one for Wren, one he kept in the lining of his winter coat. She stood, crossed to a closet near the door, reached to the back shelf, and brought down a folded coat that she laid on the table. I have not touched it since he died. I did not know what to do with it, but I have known it was there. She found the seam in the lining and drew out a folded set of papers, thin with age, covered in careful handwriting. Crane looked at them. Then he looked at Nora Prout, who was watching him with an expression that contained grief and determination in equal, inseparable measure. What are you going to do? She asked. I am going to Jefferson City, but not tonight. Tonight I need to make certain these documents are beyond reach, and that Edmund Mercer does not know what I am carrying when I leave tomorrow morning. He folded Abel's copies carefully. Is there someone outside Harrow Creek, family, a trusted friend in another town, who you could get word to tonight? My sister in the county seat. Can you reach her before morning?" Nora looked at him steadily. "My boy rides fast," she said. "He knows the night road. He has done it before." "Then send him tonight." Clement Dark was a large, unhurried man who spoke with the economical style of someone who had concluded early in life that most words were unnecessary, and had never found occasion to revise that position. He listened to Crane in his farrier shop, standing with his arms crossed and his back to the forge, his face unreadable in the orange light. When Crane finished, Clement was quiet for a moment. "Then what do you need from me?" "If something happens to me before I can leave tomorrow morning, I need someone to get word to the state attorney general's office in Jefferson City, a man named Elbert Sohn. Tell him, Crane has found sufficient grounds and is delayed. He will know what to do." Clement uncrossed his arms. "And if nothing happens to you?" "Then I ride out at first light, and this becomes someone else's problem to address from a level Edmund Mercer cannot reach." Clement considered this with the thorough patience of a man who did not make decisions in haste. "All right," he said finally. "I will be up at first light. I will watch the road." Crane offered his hand. Clement shook it once firmly and returned to his forge back at Alderman's. Crane ate supper alone and then sat at the window of his room on the upper floor, watching the street below. The settlement had gone quiet. It went quiet early in Harrow Creek, as though darkness brought with it a collective agreement to reduce visibility. Lamps burned in a few windows. The street itself was empty. At some point past 9 o'clock, he saw a rider leave from the direction of the Mercer mill and head south down the road at a pace that was not urgent but was considerably faster than casual. A message being sent, Crane thought, arrangements being made. He moved the documents from inside his coat to the bottom of his travel bag, beneath his spare clothes and his shaving kit. He sat in the chair by the door with his coat still on and did not sleep. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily through the night, and Harrow Creek lay still and dark and silent beneath the ridge, holding, as it had held for 40 years, everything that no one had found it safe enough to say. Crane was awake before dawn. He dressed in the dark, packed his bag with methodical care, and checked the documents one final time before replacing them at the bottom beneath his other belongings. Through the window, the sky was the deep blue that precedes first light, not quite night, not yet morning, a threshold color that offered no certainty about what it was becoming. He came downstairs to find Harlan Bode already behind the bar, building the morning fire. Harlan looked at him without surprise. "Coffee is not ready." "That is all right." Crane set his bag down. "A rider went south from the Mercer mill last night after 9. Where does that road go?" Harlan fed a piece of wood to the fire. "South Road runs to Caldwell Crossing. There is a telegraph office there. A telegraph was faster than a rider. Whatever Edmund Mercer had decided, the message had already been sent and the response was already in motion." "Is there anyone between here and Caldwell Crossing? Any farm on that road?" "Couple of places. The Dunbar property is about 6 miles out." Harlan paused just slightly too long. "Dunbar leases his land from Edmund," he said. Crane picked up his bag. The coffee could wait. He found Clement Dark already at the stable, as promised, saddling Crane's horse with the calm efficiency of a man who had decided to do a thing, and was doing it without ceremony. "Rider went south last night," Crane said. "Telegraphed to Caldwell Crossing. Someone may be waiting on the road." "The Dunbar farm," Clement said without looking up from the saddle. "That is what I thought." He was quiet for a moment. Then he led a second horse from the stall, his own, already saddled. "I will ride with you to the county line. 6 miles past Dunbar's. After that you are in open country and you will be all right." "You do not have to do that," Crane said. "No," Clement agreed. He handed Crane the reins. They rode out of Harrow Creek in the gray pre-dawn light, their breath and their horse's breath rising together in the cold air. The settlement fell away behind them, the mill, the church, the dark outline of the padlocked schoolhouse, and the road entered a long corridor of bare-limbed trees that closed off the view on either side. They rode in silence. Clement rode slightly ahead, his posture easy, his eyes reading the road ahead with the relaxed focus of a man who knew this terrain entirely. 4 miles out, Clement raised one hand and they stopped. Ahead, where the road curved around a stand of dead elms, a fire burned in a clearing just off the road. A small fire, the kind built for warmth during a long wait rather than for any other purpose. 2 horses were tied to a fence post at the edge of the clearing. One man sat by the fire. Another stood at the road's edge, watching them approach. The standing man was large, considerably larger than either Crane or Clement. He held his position in the center of the road with the unhurried certainty of someone accustomed to being an obstacle that others found it easier to go around. "Crane," the man said as they came within speaking distance. His voice was flat, without inflection. "Edmund Mercer had the opportunity to speak with me yesterday on the path down from the ridge," Crane said. "He said everything he needed to say." "He has more to say." "I am sure he does." Crane kept his voice even and unhurried. "But I am a state officer in the execution of an official investigation. Impeding my travel constitutes obstruction of official business, which is a criminal matter. I would encourage you to consider carefully whether Edmund Mercer's interests are worth a criminal charge." The man by the fire had stood and moved to the road. 2 of them now, blocking the path, watching Crane with the flat patience of men who had been paid to do a thing, and had decided the payment was adequate. Clement Dark said nothing. He simply moved his horse forward until it stood alongside Crane's, its shoulder almost touching the large man's, and looked down at him from the saddle with the complete, unhurried calm of someone who had run a calculation and found the result satisfactory. The large man looked up at Clement. Clement waited. The silence stretched, the fire crackled, a branch somewhere in the elms shifted and dropped. Then the large man stepped back half a pace, not dramatically, not as any concession he was willing to acknowledge, but enough. His companion at the fire looked at him, and some quiet, unspoken negotiation passed between them. "Edmund will know you left," the man said to Crane. "Edmund will know a great deal more than that," Crane said, "before this is finished." He clicked his horse forward. Clement followed. The 2 men watched them pass and did not move to stop them. They rode without speaking until the Dunbar farm was out of sight behind them, and the road opened onto flatter, wider country where the trees fell back and the sky expanded overhead, pale and cold and enormous. "Thank you," Crane said. Clement shrugged with one shoulder. "Send word from Jefferson City when it is done," he said. "Harrow Creek will want to know." At the county line, marked by nothing more than a weathered post at the road's edge, Clement pulled his horse up and stopped. Crane rode on a few paces, then turned back. "Why did he step back?" Crane asked. "The man in the road, he had every advantage." Clement looked at him steadily. "Because I was there," he said simply. "A state man alone on a road can disappear. A state man and a local witness is a different matter entirely. That is all it was, arithmetic." He turned his horse and rode north toward Harrow Creek without looking back. Crane watched him go for a moment. Then he turned south and rode hard toward Jefferson City. He arrived in Jefferson City on the second evening, cold through, and tired in the specific way of a man who has not permitted himself to stop thinking for 36 hours. He went directly to the offices of the state attorney general, a man named Elbert Sohn, whom Crane had worked with twice before and trusted with the particular careful trust that professional experience builds over time. Sohn was still at his desk when Crane arrived, which was either fortunate or simply evidence of the man's habits. He looked up, took in Crane's appearance, frost still in his coat, travel bag held close, and gestured to the chair across his desk without preamble. Crane sat down, opened his bag and laid the documents on the desk. He talked for 2 hours. Sohn listened without interruption, a quality Crane had always found remarkable in him. The ability to receive information without inserting himself into it, to let a story arrive at its own shape before beginning to assess it. He examined each document as Crane referenced it, held certain ones under the lamp for closer examination, set them down in a careful order that suggested he was already organizing them into the structure of a legal proceeding. When Crane finished, Sohn sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 40 years, he said. From 1862 to the present, possibly earlier. 3 deaths, possibly more if you look further back. I focused on the 3 most recent because the evidence is strongest there, but the pattern going backward is consistent. Sohn looked at the original survey records. If these authenticate, and I will need a land surveyor and a document examiner to confirm, then the commission records are demonstrably falsified. That is fraud. Systematic, documented, decades-long fraud against the state and against private landowners. And the deaths, Crane said. Abel Prout died 3 weeks after he found those documents and shared them with Wren Ashby. Edmund Mercer knew Abel had found them. His man had examined the deed box on the Prout property in the weeks before Abel died. Ida Mercer had been keeping records of what she had heard in the Mercer household. Her husband told Edmund what she was doing. She died 2 months later. Thomas Reeve had been corresponding with a newspaper editor in St. Louis. Elbert, I need subpoenas for the county commission records going back to 1862. I need an investigation of the 3 deaths conducted above the county level. Those investigations were deliberately inadequate, and at least one of the physicians involved has since relocated under circumstances that should be looked at carefully. And I need someone to return to Harrow Creek with proper authority, because the people there who are willing to speak cannot be left exposed. Sohn picked up a pen and began to write. The following days moved with the deliberate momentum of institutional machinery that has been properly set in motion. Sohn was thorough, and more critically, he was angry in the controlled, purposeful way that makes men effective rather than reckless. Not the anger that produces rash decisions, but the anger that produces persistence. Subpoenas were drafted. A state land surveyor was dispatched to examine and authenticate the original survey documents. A separate investigator was assigned to re-examine the 3 deaths, working above the county level. Crane filed his official report, 38 pages, documented, cross-referenced, the most complete account he had produced in 10 years of this work, and delivered copies to Sohn's office, to the State Commission, and to Wallace Cord at the Missouri Examiner in St. Louis, whose name Wren had given him. Cord, it turned out, had received 4 letters from Thomas Reeve, and had been waiting with mounting unease for a 5th that never came. On the 4th day, Crane sent 2 messages. One to Clement Dark at his farrier shop in Harrow Creek. Matter is in official hands, state level, hold steady. The other to Wren Ashby, addressed care of Sela's Webb at the general store, since he had no confidence that anything addressed directly to the North Ridge would arrive unexamined. The records have been received. What you built for 40 years is doing exactly what you built it to do. Hold on in Harrow Creek, things had shifted. The morning after Crane's departure, Edmund Mercer had ridden through the main street with 2 of his men and stopped at Alderman's, where Harlan Bode had told him, with perfect honesty, because it was entirely true, that he had no idea what documents Crane had taken or what he had found. Edmund had then gone to the Prout farm, where Nora had told him, with a composure that surprised even herself, that she had nothing to say to him. He had gone to the North Ridge. Wren had seen him coming. She stood on her porch and watched him ride up the path with the same stillness she had shown Crane several days before. When Edmund Mercer pulled up his horse at the base of her porch steps and looked up at her, she looked back at him with an expression that told him clearly, and without any words at all, that whatever he had come to do, he was too late. "You have made a mistake," Edmund said. "I have been making the same mistake for 40 years," Wren said, "believing that the truth is worth more than the cost of telling it." She looked at him without blinking. "You have spent 40 years believing the opposite. One of us has been right. We are about to find out which one." Edmund Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge without another word. It was, Silas Webb said later, the first time anyone in Harrow Creek could remember Edmund Mercer leaving a conversation without the last word. The State Commission's investigators arrived in the second week of December. 4 of them, with a surveyor, a document examiner, and the authority of the Attorney General's office stated plainly on their credentials. They set up in the schoolhouse, which was unlocked for the first time since Thomas Reeves' death, and worked with a thoroughness that the county investigations had conspicuously lacked. The original survey documents were authenticated within 2 days. The document examiner, a meticulous man from St. Louis who approached forgery with the absorbed enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work, confirmed what Wren's 18 years of records had long established. The commission boundary adjustments dating back to 1862 had been recorded on documents bearing clear evidence of systematic alteration. The ink dates did not match the paper ages. Certain entries had been made over erasures. The handwriting in key sections was consistent across decades in a way that natural variation should have prevented. Vernon Mercer was called to Jefferson City to answer questions before the State Commission. He arrived with a lawyer and left the first session visibly shaken. He returned for the second session without his lawyer, having decided that a different strategy was required, and proceeded to tell the commission a story that contradicted, in several significant particulars, the story his lawyer had told on his behalf the day before. Edmund Mercer was a more disciplined subject. He answered every question precisely, offered nothing voluntary, and maintained throughout the entire proceeding the composed, faintly regretful demeanor of a man who believes himself the victim of a misunderstanding too complex to explain to people of limited patience. He was, Crane thought, watching from the back of the room, genuinely impressive, in a way that made him more rather than less dangerous. The kind of man who can sit in a room full of evidence of what he has done and still make the people examining the evidence feel slightly uncertain. But the documents were what they were, and 40 years of Wren Ashby's meticulous notations, cross-referenced against the authenticated survey records, constructed a case that did not depend on Edmund Mercer's composure or anyone's uncertainty about anything. The State Commission ruled before the new year. The boundary adjustments from 1862 onward were voided. The original survey lines were reinstated. Property that had been absorbed into Mercer Holdings through the falsified commission records, Wren's land, Abel Pruitt's eastern acreage, 5 other properties belonging to families who had stopped protesting years ago because protesting had never worked, reverted to their original owners, or in the case of owners who had died, to their heirs. Vernon Mercer was removed from the commission and indicted on charges of fraud and falsification of public records. The reinvestigation of the 3 deaths moved more slowly, as such things always do. Abel Pruitt's death was reclassified as suspicious, pending further investigation. Ida Mercer's case was reopened. The physician who had signed her death certificate was located in Kansas City and proved, under questioning, to have a financial relationship with Clifton Mercer that had not previously been disclosed. Thomas Reeves' case, bolstered by the letters he had sent to Wallace Cord, which the Missouri Examiner entered into the official record, was referred to the state prosecutor's office. Edmund Mercer was not arrested that winter. The law moves carefully around powerful men. Crane understood this without pleasure and without surprise. But the machinery was moving, and Edmund Mercer, who had spent 40 years constructing systems designed to protect himself from precisely this kind of accountability, was discovering that those systems had a ceiling, that there was a level above the county commission's reach, that Samuel Crane had found it and used it. and that Wren Ashby had been building toward it for 4 decades with a patience that had finally, at the last possible hour, been vindicated. Crane returned to Harrow Creek on a Wednesday in early April, riding north from Jefferson City with the commission's ruling in his bag and the particular tiredness of a man who has finished something that took more out of him than he had anticipated. The settlement looked different in the spring light, or perhaps it was the same, and he was simply looking at it differently, now that the weight of what it had been carrying had finally shifted. The mill was running, fully, loudly, the wheel turning in the swollen spring creek with the sound of something that has been unblocked. Percy Webb was outside his store talking with a woman Crane didn't recognize, and raised a hand as Crane rode past, a warmer gesture than any acknowledgement he had offered in November. Harlan Bode poured him a coffee without being asked, and set it on the bar with a look that said everything that Harlan Bode's economy of expression was capable of conveying. "Clement Dark wants to see you," Harlan said, "and Nora Prout. She asked every day if there had been word." "There is word," Crane said. "Good word, tell them this evening." He finished his coffee and rode to the North Ridge. The path up to Wren's cabin was different in April. Muddy and soft underfoot, the trees beginning to bud, the light coming through the canopy at different angles now that the branches were stirring back to life. Birds had returned to the ridge and moved through the new growth with the purposeful energy of creatures reasserting their claim. Wren was in her kitchen garden when he arrived, crouched over a patch of turned earth at the south end of the fence, her hands dark with soil, working with the steady, absorbed focus of someone who has returned to a task long interrupted and is not going to be rushed. She looked up at the sound of his horse and stayed where she was, watching him dismount and tie his horse to the fence post. He crossed to where she was kneeling and held out the commission's ruling, a formal document, folded and sealed with the state seal, addressed to Wren Ashby of Widow's Peak, Harrow Creek, Missouri. She looked at it without taking it for a moment. Then she took it from his hand, broke the seal, and unfolded it. She read it slowly, all the way through, while Crane stood in the mud of her kitchen garden and listened to the birds in the ridge timber and waited. When she finished, she folded it again along its original creases. She was quiet for a long time. Around them, the early April wind moved through the new buds with a sound that was nothing like the winter wind, lighter, uncertain, full of a promise that had not yet decided exactly what it intended to keep. "The land," she said at last, "reinstated to its original boundaries as of 1848, Crane said. "Yours, clear, with no further commission jurisdiction at the county level. Any future boundary questions go directly to the state." Marin looked at the document in her hands. "Eli would have been 60 years old this year," she said, "not as a wound reopened, but as a fact being set down in its proper place. Acknowledged, recorded, given its weight." "Yes," Crane said. "He never got to walk the eastern slope. They cut off our access to the creek when he was 9 years old. He used to ask me when he was small why we never went down there." She looked out over her garden toward the eastern slope, where the land fell away through birch trees toward the sound of the creek below. "I told him it was not ours anymore. I should have told him it was never truly theirs either, that there is a difference between what someone takes and what they own." Crane said nothing. Some things do not need a response. Wren stood slowly, brushing the soil from her hands and her knees, and straightened with the careful deliberateness of a 73-year-old body that had been kneeling too long in cold mud. She looked at Crane with an expression that was not happiness exactly. Happiness seemed too simple a word for what 40 years of loss and 40 years of resistance and one April morning of vindication can produce in a person's face. It was something more like the expression of someone who has set down a weight they carried so long they had stopped believing it was separate from themselves. "The Mercers," she said. "Vernon has been indicted. The 3 deaths are under active reinvestigation at the state level. Edmund," Crane paused. "Edmund will take longer. Men like Edmund always take longer, but the documentation is in state hands now. There is a newspaper in St. Louis with a great deal of what Thomas Reeve sent them, and there is an attorney general who is angry in the specific way that produces results. He met her eyes. It will not be undone. What you built over 40 years, it will not be undone. Wren nodded slowly. She looked at the document one final time, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside her coat, close against her chest. The same gesture, Crane realized, that he had used when he carried it down this ridge in November. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee, the real kind, not whatever it is that Harlan Bode serves." That evening, Crane sat with Clement Dark and Nora Prout and Harlan Bode in Alderman's and told them everything. The commission ruling, the indictment, the reinvestigations, the newspaper's involvement. Nora listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Good." Just that word, with the entire weight of 14 months of grief and waiting and silence behind it. Clement said nothing, as was his habit, but he raised his glass slightly before drinking, which from Clement was the equivalent of a considerable speech. Silas Webb had come in partway through and stood at the bar, listening. "What happens to Harrow Creek now?" he asked when Crane finished. Crane looked around the room, at the people who had lived for 40 years, inside the particular silence that power and fear construct when they work together over a long time. "The mill keeps running," he said. "The land goes back to the people it belongs to. The schoolhouse reopens. The rest is up to Harrow Creek." Silas nodded slowly. "And the woman on the ridge?" "Wren Ashby," Crane said, "is an elderly woman who lives on her own land and tends her kitchen garden, and has, over the course of 40 years, compiled the most thorough and meticulous documentation of institutional fraud I have encountered in my professional life." He set down his glass. "That is what she is. That is all she ever was." The fire in the corner burned steadily. Outside, the April night was mild enough that no one had bothered to latch the door against the cold, and through the gap came the sound of the creek running full and fast with snowmelt, the sound of water moving freely over ground it had a right to cross. Crane rode out of Harrow Creek the following morning. He did not go up to the ridge to say goodbye. He had said what needed to be said, and Wren Ashby was not a woman who required the formalities of departure. She was, he suspected, already back in her kitchen garden when he rode south down the main street, already turning soil in the early morning light, already planning what she would grow in the eastern section, now that the creek access was hers again. At the edge of the settlement, he stopped his horse and looked back once. Harrow Creek lay still in the April morning. Its houses quiet, the mill turning, smoke rising from chimneys in the uncomplicated way that smoke rises from places where people are simply living their lives. The North Ridge rose above it all, its timber green now with the first real flush of spring, birch and oak and pine dense against the pale sky. In the single south-facing window of the cabin at the summit of the ridge, a lamp burned, as it always had, through all the years, through all the seasons, through every attempt to extinguish what it stood for. Crane turned south and rode. Behind him, the lamp burned on. "I want to tell you what I think this story is really about. It is not about a curse. It is not about a mysterious woman. The town of Harrow Creek needed those stories, needed to believe in something strange and inexplicable, because the truth was harder to live with. The truth was that the people in that town had watched a system consume their neighbors for 40 years and had, most of them, decided that speaking up wasn't worth the cost. Wren Ashby understood this. She had no illusions about it. She had lost her husband, her son, her land access, her financial security, and she had spent decades being called strange and dark and dangerous by people who were simply afraid and needed her to carry that fear for them. And she documented everything anyway. Not because she was certain anyone would ever come. not because she had been given any reason to believe that the system would eventually turn in her direction, but because she understood that the only thing left available to her was patience, and she was going to use it completely. The real spell over Harrow Creek was never Wren Ashby. The real spell was the belief that nothing could change, that powerful men were permanent features of the landscape, like the ridge itself, that the cost of speaking was always going to be higher than the cost of silence. Wren spent 40 years being the one person in Harrow Creek who refused to believe that. And she was right. I find myself thinking about that lamp in her window, burning through all of it, all the winters, all the years when no one came and the documentation grew and the Mercers continued as though permanence was their natural state. That lamp was not darkness. It was the opposite. It was the stubborn, solitary refusal to accept that what had been taken was truly gone. And in the end, it outlasted everything that had tried to extinguish it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new story drops every week. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to go again, watch it from the beginning. You will catch things the second time that you missed.